Well, if you will, turn to Daniel chapter 8. We're in the 8th chapter. Daniel has received another vision. This one takes place 2 years after the previous vision. We saw last week that Daniel had received that first vision in the first year of Belshazzar's reign, and Daniel received this vision during the king's third year. Daniel says he has this vision in the capital city of Susa while sitting beside the Ulai Canal. And there are, depending on which translation, for example, the King James Version pronounces it or translates it as Shushan, but it's the same place. It's just a little different pronunciation of the same Hebrew word. I should point out that Daniel chapter 1 is in Hebrew. We get to chapter 2 through 7, or in chapter 2 it changes to Aramaic, and it's in Aramaic and through chapter 7, and when we get to chapter 8, it goes back to Hebrew, and then remains in Hebrew for the remaining chapter. So Susa was one of the capital cities for the Medes. I remember when I was youth minister in Boone that the church there during the summer increased in attendance. It's the only church I've ever worked with that attendance was larger in the summer than it was in the rest of the year. Anybody guess why? Snowbirds. The word is snowbirds. All these couples who had homes along the coast and they lived there in the winter, and then when it started getting hot, they came up to the mountains for the cooler weather. Well, that's what Susa was. Susa was in the southern region of the kingdom, and it was the seasonal capital. Daniel says that he was at this capital and that he was sitting beside this canal, which ran beside the capital city. The canal connected two important rivers. Historians weren't sure if it was natural or it was dug, man-made canal. It was definitely used for irrigation. Now, these places don't mean too much today. For us, these names, we don't recognize them much. I mean, we might recognize the name Susa only because of Daniel, but we don't know where it is. I mean, we don't know where it is. Archaeologists might, but Daniel is placing this historically, geographically. This is where I was. So letting his readers know where he was when he had this vision. And so Daniel is going to see a couple of animals. He's going to see a ram with two horns and a goat that seemed to run quickly along the ground without ever touching the ground. The goat, which has only one horn, attacks the ram and wins and demonstrates great power. But suddenly the goat's horn breaks off and it's replaced by four horns, and one of those horns begins to grow in size, and this new horn begins to oppress God's people. And Daniel asks how long this is going to last, how long the God's people will be oppressed. And Daniel begins to consider the meaning of this vision, but he's unable to understand it. Thankfully, Gabriel is sent to Daniel to explain it to him. Daniel comments when the vision's over that it just left him exhausted. In fact, it would be several days after this vision before he's able to go back to work again. So from his reaction to it, this seems to be a troubling vision for Daniel. All right, so with that kind of overview, let's get into it, and we'll start in verse 1. So Daniel 8, beginning with verse 1. In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. So David receives again this vision in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. Belshazzar's reign ended in Daniel. It ended in chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 5, that's the chapter where the king sees the handwriting on the wall, and that evening the Babylonian Empire is taken over by the Medes, and the king is killed. So it happened before the events described in Daniel chapter 5. The vision is sometimes compared to that first one. While the first one was filled with 4 animals, that filled, and it's just filled with apocalyptic writing, this vision will be a lot more concrete. So that's nice. It'll be a little easier to understand because of that. Verse 3, he says, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it. None could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. So 2 horns, one's longer than the other, even though it grew later. And this ram represents the kingdom of the Medes and the Persian, the Medo-Persian Empire, which replaced the Babylonian Empire. Babylon had already seen its glory days when Daniel has this vision. Babylon is still in control, but the best was behind. Nebuchadnezzar is dead. And so it's not the kingdom, it's not as great as it was, it's not as strong as it was. And so in its place is going to come the Medes and the Persians, represented by these 2 horns. And while both were strong empires, later the Persian part of it was the stronger of the 2. And so Daniel says he sees this ram and it's just going across the land wherever it wants. Nothing is able to stop it. The directions Daniel gave were west, north, and south, and mentioned last week that these directions represent military campaigns the Medo-Persian Empire was involved in and won. It just did as it pleased. Again, no one could stop it, and as a result, it became very strong and very great. But like the Babylonians before them, there'd be a time when it too lost its power and someone rose up to take its place. Verse 5 says, as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Now, how does an animal move across the ground without touching the ground? It's not flying. He didn't say it was flying. He didn't say it had wings. It's not touching the ground. It probably shouldn't be taken literally, but illustrates the speed with which this animal is moving. I mean, it's moving so fast, it just appears to be hovering. I think of the Roadrunner. He's going so fast, he doesn't appear to be touching the ground either. And Wile E. Coyote, in order to keep up with it, had to strap rockets to its back, right, to catch up to the Roadrunner. And I think that's probably what is happening here. I've never thought of goats as being particularly fast, but this one was so fast it didn't even look like it was touching the ground. Now, it's interesting to note that in the 1st century BC, so before Christ, a zodiac list identified Persia as a ram. And 200 years after Daniel, it lists, more than 200 years before Daniel, there was a list that that referred to the Greeks as goats. So no explanation why they were referred to by goats, but in Daniel's vision, he sees a ram representing the Medo-Persian Empire and a goat representing the Greek Empire. And so the Greek Empire seemed to have risen overnight and just quickly spread across the world, defeating whoever it came across. As Daniel saw, it came in from the west. Verse 6, it came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. Now remember how verse 4 described the ram. It could go wherever it wanted, do whatever it wanted. No one could stop it. But now, this goat, which is a smaller animal, with just one horn, not two, takes it on and takes it out. Now, the one horn is a reference to Alexander the Great. Verse 7, I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. Just as no one had been able to stop the ram, in the height of his power, no one is able to stop the goat. No one's able to assist the ram. Alexander the Great attacked the Medo-Persian Empire during the reign of Darius III, so long after Daniel had died. As I mentioned last week, Daniel served until the third year of Cyrus, who ruled after Darius I. Now, Daniel describes this goat's attack, as being vicious, breaking both of the ram's horns. Alexander the Great had set out to liberate Greece from Persian rule, because Persian rule had spread that far. So he's trying to liberate themselves from Persian rule. At the same time, he wanted to spread Greek culture or Hellenistic culture as far and wide as he could. And of course, those who were conquered by Alexander didn't like that. They didn't like the introduction of Hellenism into their culture and religion any more than they liked, being forced to recognize Persian culture. And so Alexander the Great and his army crossed over from Greece into Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, in 334 BC. And Alexander met Darius III in battle over 600 miles away just a year later. So he's covering 600 miles and defeating whoever he comes across in a single year. Right? He's moving for an army. He's moving pretty quickly, defeating everyone he comes across. And he so demolished the Persian army that Darius ran away. Literally. He left his wife. He left his children. He left all of his goods, everything he had. He just wanted to get away because he knew what would happen, and he fled to Egypt. I think that's right. Anyway, he fled away. Yeah, turn south. Now, before Alexander took Persia, any further Persian territory, he went south to Egypt. And Egypt, like Greece, wasn't happy with the Persians. And so they happily accepted the Greeks. He happily accepted Alexander the Great's rule to get rid of the Persian. Now, if strength and speed of the goat with his powerful horn weren't amazing enough, wait and see what happens next. Verse 8, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, as I said, Babylon had the height of its power, and it was just going everywhere it wanted. But then it started losing power, and so the Medes and Persians rose up and conquered them, right? And so they did real well, did whatever they wanted until they started declining. And in their decline, the Greeks rose up, but the Greeks didn't decline. In the height of their power, this horn is broken off. And we know that now that represents the death of Alexander the Great. Just as quickly as the goat with this powerful horn rose to power, the horn was broken off. Alexander the Great succeeded his father, Philip II, in 336 at the age of 20. And he spent his reign not sitting on a throne ruling in Greece. He spent his reign out conquering territory, taking more lands throughout Asia and Egypt. And in 10 short years, he had created one of the largest armies in history, stretching from Greece to northwest India in 10 years. And in those years, he was undefeated in battle. And as a result, he's often considered to be one of history's greatest, most successful military commanders. But all of that came to an end at the age of 32. Alexander died in Babylon in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And history is unclear about how he died, but poison is often mentioned. And so he was a powerful leader. It just didn't last long. He died fairly young. And so Daniel saw this horn that's being broken off, and it's replaced by 4 smaller horns. After Alexander died, his kingdom was divided up between his 4 generals. And then one of those generals gained prominence over the others, was stronger than the others. 2 of the generals, one given rule in Egypt and the other in Syria and Babylon, both wanted Israel. One to the south, one to the northeast. They both had their eye on Jerusalem and Israel, and the one that took it was the one over Syria and Babylon. And his name was Antiochus, a general who he descended from one of the generals that had served Alexander the Great. And the next few verses describe his actions. Am I being clear? I feel like I'm being confusing. So these 4 horns, one of the horns is going to be dominant, but he's a descendant of that general. All right, verse 9. One of them came, then out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. So Israel's mentioned here as the beautiful land. And this little horn grows in power and was eventually able to take over Israel as its power increased to the south and the east. And again, this horn is Antiochus. Antiochus is remembered as one of the cruelest rulers to ever rise to power. He took the throne of his father. And somewhere along the line, his older brother was murdered. And that's how he came to the throne. Do you think he really wanted to rule? I mean, if you kill your brother, have your brother killed, conspire to have him killed, you want it pretty badly. And so Daniel says that he grew in power and became exceedingly great. And how did he become exceedingly great? Well, history tells us that he bribed and murdered his way into greatness. Now, his full title is Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. And he gave himself the title Epiphanes, which means illustrious. Gives you an idea of what he thought of himself. Illustrious. Now, the Jews didn't like him. Of course, they're not liking anybody with this coming in and ruling over them. They didn't call him Epiphanes. They called him Epimanes, That's close to Epiphanes. It sounds similar, but it doesn't mean illustrious, it means crazy. That's what they thought of him. They thought he was a little crazy, irrational. Antiochus probably didn't like that, but it was an accurate description. And we'll see just how crazy he was as we continue. Verse 10. All right, so this horn grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. Now, in the Old Testament, the starry host can be used to describe angels, but it can also be used to describe rulers, people, but rulers, kings, national leaders. And sometimes, occasionally, a couple of times, it's used to refer to God's people, so the Israelites as a whole. And this seems to be how Daniel's using it here. Antiochus persecuted and murdered many Jews and Jewish leaders. And so the starry host here probably refers to God's people who he had murdered. And Daniel goes on here and sees somewhat of what Antiochus would do to the Jewish people. Antiochus just hated the Jews. He just disliked them. He hated anything Jewish. In fact, stories go that if he found a Jewish boy, he would have him hung. Right on sight. He would murder people on sight. He was just vicious and cruel. Verse 11, it set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord, and so the leaders of God's people. It took away daily sacrifices from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. So when Antiochus came to power, one of the first things in Israel, one of the first things he did was he got rid of the Jewish leaders. He just took them off and had them executed. Not only that, but he stopped the temple worship. So twice a day, Jews would offer sacrifices to God, morning and evening, which is stipulated in the law that God gave. But he stopped that. He stopped the daily sacrifices. But it gets worse. History tells us that Antiochus erected a statue of himself, and he placed it in the temple. And he was represented by the Greek god Zeus. And then, if that's not enough, he had a pig sacrificed on the altar. Now you understand, pigs are unclean. You don't do that. He was intentionally trying to desecrate the altar. And so he had this pig sacrificed on the altar. He took the blood, had it sprinkled around the Temple Mount and on whatever Jews were nearby, and forced as many of them as he could to eat the pig. So he was as desperate as he could to defile the altar, the temple, and everything the Jews believed in and held sacred relating to their worship of God. Now, we might have to wonder, why would God allow that to happen? This is his temple. These are his people. They spent 70 years plus in Babylon. God had allowed them to come back to rebuild the temple. And now this is happening. Well, the next verse explains it. Verse 12. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Daniel says God allows this ruler to come to power and to desecrate the temple. He didn't destroy it, but he stopped worship and he desecrated the temple, all because of the rebellion of God's people. Even after the years they spent in Babylon, finally able to return to the promised land, you would think they had learned their lesson, right? Well, I guess not. I guess they hadn't. For example, one of the high priests was Jason. He was serving as high priest when Antiochus came to power. He had already been neglecting the sacrifices, and he wanted to conform Judaism to Greek culture and religion. So because of their sins, God allows Antiochus to defile the temple and the people. The Jews had just invited God's judgment because of their sins. So God had said that the priesthood, was limited to the tribe of Levi. If you wanted to serve as a priest, you had to be from this tribe. In order to be high priest, you had to be a descendant of Aaron. But Jason allowed anyone to be a priest as long as they could pay him enough money. So if you bribed the right person, you could have any position you wanted. And sometimes those positions, like Antiochus, were gained by murder and intrigue. And so as a result, many of the Jews had been led again into idolatry. And Antiochus murdered more than 100,000 Jews. Now, that's less than Hitler had killed, but the population was a lot smaller as well. He openly blasphemed and opposed God. So why did God allow him? The Lord allowed it, but he only allowed it for a short time. Antiochus, like the name the Jews gave him, eventually went mad. The rest of his story and how the Jews revolted can be found in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So if you're interested, you can find those online, a lot of places. And those two books describe one particular event in the rebellion that is still remembered today by the Jews in Hanukkah. So Hanukkah came about as part of the revolt against Antiochus and the events during that rebellion. Now, it's amazing. So you've heard the description, the interpretation for the ram as the Medo-Persians, the goat being Greece, and these four horns, the four generals. It's amazing how accurate Daniel's prophecy was or is. And because of that, there have been some who have supposed that it actually wasn't written by Daniel, but it was written by someone after these events, saying that Daniel prophesied them when in really, it's just somebody looking back in history. But they forget that God knows the end from the beginning. And this isn't the only prophecy we find in the Old Testament. And we see just how accurate God is. God knows prophecy. He gives prophecy so that when we know when it happens, that it is from him. Verse 13 says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, 'How long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people.'" Daniel wants to know how long God is going to allow it to happen. How long will he allow the temple to be treated this way, his own people to be treated this way? And he's going to be given a number. Verse 14, he said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." So Antiochus is allowed to rule, and it's as a judgment against God's people. God allows it to discipline his own people. Now, what's interesting about that is we know when that happened. There are historical documents describing it. The revolt of the Maccabees lasted from 167 to 160, so about 7 years. The confusing part is the number 2,300. What does the 2,300 represent? Mornings and evenings. Some think it refers to 2,300 days. You got morning and evening days. Others, however, think it refers to the morning and evening sacrifices. So it's not 2,300 days, but 2,300 sacrifices, morning and evening total. So if that's it, then you cut the number in half. So then you get the number of days is half of that, or 1,150. Now, which is right? Well, the answer is both of them are right, depending on what you're counting. 2,300 days is the amount of time from between when Antiochus began to persecute the Jews until the time the temple was cleansed. 2,300 days. 2,300 is the number of morning and evening sacrifices that were missed. So Antiochus began persecuting the Jews, but the sacrifices didn't end yet. And it's 1,150 days from when the sacrifices stopped until the temple is cleansed and they resume. So both numbers work, depend on what you're counting. When he took power or when he stopped the sacrifices, but both end at the same time when the sacrifices resumed. Now, I've given you interpretation for these verses, and we know from history, but we also know because in the verses that follow, Daniel is given interpretation. You know, all of this was in the future for Daniel, but he's going to be given the meaning. Verse 15. He says, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. So Gabriel is sent to give Daniel the meaning of this vision. And we'll see that even after the explanation, though, Daniel doesn't really understand it. He doesn't understand it because it's still future. And he doesn't have the details that we do because of history. You know, we're looking back, we've seen these events pass, and so we can point to what they mean. He's still looking future, and so there's no way he really could understand. Verse 17, as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. Now, notice first Daniel's reaction when Gabriel appears. You know, today we picture angels in ways that bring us comfort, right? We all have our own guiding angel who's going to take care of us. Angels are comforting. But do you know of a single Bible character who, when seeing an angel, was comforted? In fact, in most cases, the first word out of the angel's mouth is, do not fear. Do not fear. Fear not. You know, think about this. You know, the reaction to seeing an angel. And if that's their reaction to seeing an angel, what would their reaction to seeing God be? Yeah, Isaiah tells us, Isaiah chapter 6, verse 5, he didn't see God. He sees God's throne filled with God's glory. And he says, woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. John tells us about seeing Jesus on the Isle of Patmos. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. You know, Jesus teaches us to refer to God as Father, but I wonder sometimes if we don't approach God a little too casually. Gabriel says that this vision is intended for the time of the end, which means that the vision isn't just for Daniel's time, and shortly thereafter, it has implications for the ultimate fulfillment of God's purposes. The end. You know, the word there has three different aspects. There's the end of an activity. There's a time of God's judgment, a future period of God's judgment, but also can refer to the end of time. And so in this vision, Daniel sees an end to the reign of Antiochus. He sees a time of God's judgment, but it also looks forward to when the end of times, when Jesus returns and God will be worshiped as the true God. This vision talks about the end of times as well before Jesus returns. You know, many see a connection between Antiochus and the Antichrist because of the way, because of their attitude towards God. The things that Antiochus did and the things that the Antichrist will do. So is Daniel seeing a vision about Antiochus, or is he seeing a vision about the Antichrist? Or is it fulfilled in both? And I think it's probably both. The vision was fulfilled in Antiochus, but it will be completely fulfilled when the Antichrist comes and will appear before the return of Jesus. Verse 18 says that while he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. Now, that one's kind of puzzling as well. Now remember, Daniel's having a vision. How do you go to sleep in a vision? But it says, I fell asleep. As he was speaking, I was in a deep sleep, face to the ground. He's not certain what's happening. Maybe that explains, some of what Paul said when he had a vision. He wasn't sure if he, visited the third heaven, whether that was in the body or whether it was just a vision. It was just too real and too confusing at the time. Or you remember when Peter was released from jail by the angel. The angel comes and gets him and wakes him up, and as he's walking along, suddenly all the gates open, the doors open, and it's not until he gets outside of the city gate that he realized he wasn't having a dream. He thought he was just dreaming it till he got outside. So Daniel says he fell into a sleep in the middle of this vision. But Gabriel touches him and gets him back on his feet. All right, so now Gabriel will give the interpretation that we've just gone over. So we'll just read these verses. He said, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation. Alexander's four generals. He died too quickly to be able to put a succession plan in place, and so it got divided up among those four generals. It says, but will not have the same power. Right? These four kingdoms won't have the same power that Alexander the Great did. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels, that is, the Jews who were ignoring God's laws, have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, remember how Antiochus came to power, will arise. The immediate interpretation again is of Antiochus, but in long term, it also refers to the Antichrist. It says he will become very strong, but not by his own power. And in Revelation, we see that the Antichrist doesn't have his own power, but he's given power from the beast. It says he will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior, which is why he called himself Epiphanes. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, Jesus. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Again, it's Jesus who will destroy the Antichrist. Verse 26, the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. So it's going to be several years, several decades before Antiochus, or Alexander the Great, several years before the Medes or Alexander the Great comes to power, and then later before Antiochus does. Again, the vision would be meaningful for the Jews living during the reign of Antiochus. I wonder if they understood that this vision by Daniel was concerning them, but it's also going to be relevant at the end of times. Verse 27, I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So he's so overwhelmed by this vision that he's unable to work for several days. It affected him physically, not just emotionally, but physically, and perhaps in part to the fact that even though he'd been given an explanation, he still didn't understand it. There's just too many pieces missing for him to be able to know, what this is going to mean. It'd be Antiochus who reigns to power. He's not given that name. He's not given that much detail. Again, it's much easier to understand it today, looking back. In 1960, there was an episode of the TV show Twilight Zone. You remember the Twilight Zone. One of the episodes was called A Most Unusual Camera. And it featured a Polaroid camera that didn't take a picture of the present, but it took a picture of the future. You take a picture of this, and what it shows you is what this is going to look like tomorrow at this time. And there was this couple who stole it from a pawn shop, and they didn't know what it was, but so they took the picture, and it just seemed strange because it's not what he was taking a picture of, and he finally realized, it's taking the future. So he goes down to the horse track and takes a picture of the winners of tomorrow's horse race. Well, he takes a picture of today's, but it's giving him the winners of tomorrow's horse race. And so, you can imagine what he did with it. He was able to make a lot of money from doing that. And that would be tempting, wouldn't it? And if you had that ability to take a picture to see what the sports scores are going to be tomorrow, or the stock market, right? And it would be tempting to use it like that to make money. In that episode, the three people who eventually possessed the camera all died tragically. None of them was willing to use the camera to forecast the future for something good. We know that Jesus is going to return, but we don't know exactly when. Daniel's given this vision, but it's still pretty vague. He doesn't know exactly. And if we had that camera and, we could know when Jesus is going to return, what would we do with it? Would we use the information wisely? We're left with knowledge that Jesus will return, but we're not given enough specifics to know exactly when. Like Daniel wasn't given enough specifics to know, just map it. Oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. This is when, right? So what do we do in the meantime? Well, Jesus has said that we're to use what information we do have to seek and to save the lost. Having this information, the information we do have, shouldn't turn us into stargazers, seeing if we can predict when Jesus is going to return. but it should turn us into soul winners. The prophecy shouldn't make us smug about our own salvation. It should make us servants of Jesus. Our job is to keep serving, keep watching, keep witnessing, keep working until Jesus comes. He gives us this information so that when it does come, we'll know, right, this is from God. But until then, we're to be working. There's an old hymn that I think that puts it very well, right? We'll work till Jesus comes. O land of rest, for thee I sigh. When will the moment come when I shall lay my armor by and dwell in peace at home? We'll work till Jesus comes. We'll work till Jesus comes. We'll work till Jesus comes, and we'll be gathered home. So the prophecy is given, but not so we can know exact times. Again, to bring us comfort, to know the end, not when, but to know that Jesus is coming. And so we can trust in that. Let's pray. Lord, we do thank you. We don't need to know everything, and if we did, I sometimes wonder what we would do with that knowledge. But we know that we can trust you, that you are in control of the past, the present, and the future. And so, Lord, we trust you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.